Good day, morning or afternoon, depending on whichever is applicable to you. My name is Timo Rantalainen, and I'm a biomechanist, and I've been given an opportunity to talk about bone loading and skeletal development by the organizing committee, and ARIS in particular. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about a topic I really enjoy talking about. So I'm a biomechanist, but I've tried to tailor my talk to what I expect you to be the most interested in.
I've divided my talk into three parts. The first part is going to be on bone ontogeny and adaptation to loading. So just revising on the healthy development of bone throughout the lifespan. The second part is going to be about site-specific bone adaptations across the lifespan. So let's take a look at what sort of adaptations to exercise we tend to see, and this is mostly based on cross-sectional data. And then the final part is going to be on applying these principles of mechanical responsivity of bone into loading interventions. I'm primarily going to be citing my own work, but it's not far off the consensus or sort of the prevailing view in the field. But I just wanted to flag that I am plugging my own work mercilessly throughout the talk. Right, before we get into it, I've recorded my talk not in chronological order, so I noticed a few stop-ups later on in the talk. I meant paraplegic and osteogenesis imperfecta. You'll know what I mean when you get there. In any case, so by ontogeny, I mean the development from an early or young age into adulthood, and then I've extended that into aging in this particular slide as well. We've got two processes that are driving bone growth and the emergence of bone shape. Modeling, which is the primary growth of the bone, that's essentially being driven by genetics. It occurs prior to closure of the epiphysis, and it will occur even in absence of loading, although the cross-sectional shape of the bone will not match what you would have if you did have the loading. So someone who gets paralyzed early on in their life, they'll end up with a different bone shape than they would if they weren't paralyzed. But their limb dimensions will be pretty similar to what they would have been if they weren't paralyzed. And then you got the other process, which is remodeling, which works on the pre-existing bone material. And there's the balance between removal or excavation or resorption of existing bone, and then laying on replacing bone or bone mineral apposition. The schematic on the right is from Professor Egon Siemens' excellent review from 2008, and this still holds true today. So up until puberty, which takes place at a younger age in women compared to men, or females compared to males, the growth of the bones is fairly similar, so it's difficult to tell apart the skeleton of a young boy from a young girl. However, at puberty, women start laying on sort of extra mineral, I suppose for lactation, and because of that extra mineral, they'll actually, their medullary cavity will actually get narrower with age. At the time of puberty, but this extra mineral causes the bones to become more mechanically strong, and that's probably one of the reasons why women then end up with a small slender skeleton compared to boys. And of course, in case of boys, because they get to puberty at a more advanced age compared to girls, they've got more time for growth, for linear growth, so they end up being a little bit taller. Then subsequent to having grown to adulthood, we start of course the aging process is ongoing at all times, but sort of moving from adulthood to adulthood, our bones will keep on getting larger, so the dimensions will grow, and then the medullary area will keep on growing larger and larger. And in women, of course, menopause and the removal of this excess mineral later on for lactation will then cause or make women susceptible to osteoporosis late in life. Well, not late in life, around menopause, which of course you have several decades of life after that, unless you're unlucky. So we've seen the same, or what was shown in the schematic. I've seen this in a cross-sectional data set from the Griffith University, from Belinda Beck's lab. And these are tibial shaft scans at 66% from the ankle towards the knee. And these are computed tomography scans. And I plotted the tibia and the fibula here. And I made the claim that these are quite difficult to tell apart prior to puberty. So let's say here at 9 to 10 years of age, they are fairly similar in shape. I suppose if you're really looking closely, you'd make the argument, I'd make the argument at least, that boys are already a smidge more robust here at 9 to 10 years of age, but the difference, so the sexual dimorphism really emerges around puberty. So if we start looking at 13 to 14 years of age, boys are much more robust in their bone shape compared to girls here. And the difference just keeps getting larger and larger with age. And of course, men tend to be, so these are unadjusted. I forgot to mention that, sorry. So these are unadjusted. So at 19 to 29 years of age, men are, of course, on the average, taller and heavier. So you'd expect them to have larger bones anyways. But even if we adjust for body size, men tend to have a more robust skeleton compared to women. The same is true, or same can be observed from the distal radius, and really the same story there. You can't really tell girls and boys apart at 11 to 12 years of age, but then men keep on growing and putting on more muscle mass and end up with more robust distal radius and ulna, of course, compared to women. So I've been talking about normal development up to this point, but as a biomechanist, I'm obviously interested in what is the effect of mechanical loads on the development, and that's been formalized as the Wool's law, whereby it has been recognized that bones adapt their mass and geometry to the prevailing loading. And of course, this is very evident, again, using the same example of paralysis. It has a major effect on the shape of the bone. Well, with Wool's law, it was recognized that increased loading is associated with increased bone strength and vice versa, so decreased loading was associated with decreased strength. We have subsequently discovered that the adaptations are region-specific. I suppose it was sort of a part of Wool's original discovery. I think they were looking at the femoral neck trabeculae that are actually not being driven by the mechanical loads as far as we can tell nowadays, but nevertheless, our understanding has obviously evolved since the first realization that our bones do respond to mechanical loads. So I've highlighted here on the left bottom hand corner Liz Colan Hertz's rabbit paper, which is one of the first ones, or the first one I know of, where this was actually experimentally tested. So these were growing rabbits. The experimental limb, so it's the same rabbit here, the experimental limb was loaded and the contralateral limb was used as the control. And so on the control tibia, they observed growth of the bone as you would in a growing rabbit. But with the loaded limb, they observed a directions or sort of directionality in the response, in that the parts of the bone were gaining more loading related bone mass compared to other parts. So here on this left hand side, they observed more bone gains here compared to, for example, here at the bottom part, where really no evident increase in bone size was seen with the loading. Well, this finding has been replicated in, or we found a similar finding in a cross-sectional study comparing athletes, high-impact athletes in this case, who engaged with high jumping and long jumping, compared to non-athletic reference. Actually, the high-impact athletes seem to have sort of pretty uniform increase in bone mass to all directions, but we also had soccer players, which we classified as odd impact athletes, so impacts from sort of all sorts of directions, also moving laterally, doing changes of direction, those sorts of stuff, and endurance runners as well. And with those groups, we primarily saw a difference to the reference group here at the anterior and the posterior aspect of the tibia. Interestingly to me, there was very little difference in the fibula between the athletic groups compared to the non-athletic groups, and I'll come back to this finding later on in my talk. And then I suppose to me, one of the best evidence of this sort of region-specific adaptations in humans would be this study here, reported by Hongqiang Ma, where he had a sample of identical twins, and they shared their genes, so they were monozygotic, meaning that they have the same genes. And they've been discordant for physical activity for at least 30 years at the time of scanning. And so one of the twins had engaged with regular physical activity throughout their adulthood, and the other twin had not. And in that particular data set, Hongqiang observed about a 20% difference in bone mass at the tibial shaft, and it was conspicuously direction specific. So this posterior aspect of the tibia and the anterior aspect of the tibia differed between the twins, whereas not much was seen here laterally or medially. This idea has further been formalized with the mechanostat hypothesis that was formulated. The formulation of the hypothesis was driven by Professor Frost. I think he's late Professor Frost now. And so this is sort of a schematic illustration of the idea. So with unloading or bed rest or spaceflight, with very low bone strain, so strain meaning deformation, I'll actually come back to it in the next slide pretty much. We'll have bone loss. Then in the maintenance rate, so if you're able to walk and you do a bit of walking, you go through your daily activities but don't really do any vigorous activity, we'll be maintaining our bone with increased loading. So increase means increase to what we were doing before. So let's say you started jogging when you'd only done walking up to this point, you might get into this range where we start laying on additional bone. If we really go into overloading, like here, we become susceptible to stress fractures. And also it's been highlighted that remodeling, so in this sort of increasing bone loading range, we get lamellar drift, but we may actually start producing some woven bone when we really overload the bone. And so I suppose if you saw some woven bone formation in humans, you start being concerned that they're at risk of a fracture. I'm not entirely sure where these numbers come from. I've read these two papers and many others by Professor Frost, and I could not find a citation for any particular microstrain value. So I think these are just guesstimates. But nevertheless, the concept still holds. So with unloading, rapid bone loss, and then with overloading, we start seeing those stress fractures and everything in between. So I'll just quickly talk about deformation and strain. So if we start with a bone, as schematically represented by this rectangle here, And we then apply a tensile load, so a load that makes the structure longer. We end up making the structure longer, as I said, but simultaneously, because bone is almost incompressible, it will also become narrower. And therefore, when we apply a tensile strain in one direction, we will have a compressive strain at a right angle to the tensile strain, and they'll have an opposite sign. So longitudinally here, we made the bone longer, so we'll have a positive number change in height divided by a positive number. So that's a positive strain is a tensile strain. And then in the transverse or the horizontal direction here, we've actually made it narrower. We've lost some width. Therefore, the change in width is negative in sign. And so a negative strain indicates a compressive or shortening strain. So it's entirely impossible, because bone is almost incompressible, to not have both tensile and compressive strain. So if there's any strain present on any given point in bone, it will have both tensile and compressive. Also shear, I'm not going to get into more detail on strain fields and all of that. But nevertheless, the key takeaway from this slide is that when we're talking about bone loads, we tend to talk about strain. And strain, very simply, just means the ratio of the change in length divided by the original unloaded length. So that's all that strain is the relative amount of deformation. And why we talk about strain is because the mechanosensitivity of bone is driven by changes in shape. So the osteocyte is what we think currently that is responsive for mechanosensing, senses the changes in shape, and then the cascade of molecular signaling begins from there. So to sort of summarize the revision of sort of the basic ontogeny and sort of mechanobiology of bone, is this that we developed this understanding of what drives the osteogenicity of a bout of loading is primarily based on animal experiments, but to me that's sort of a strength of this understanding, because really all of the things mentioned here are experimentally verified in animal models. So the effect of a loading bout or a loading regimen on bone depends on the magnitude of each individual loading cycle, the rate of loading, so how quickly the load is being applied. Then when we start looking at a bout of loading, how many loading cycles were applied. So 20 loading cycles is going to be more effective than 10 loading cycles and so forth. Then we got the loading direction. I think that's actually shown here, or Rubin and Lanyon demonstrated this phenomenon. So this is a turkey ulna, and if it's loaded in bending around this axis, it will produce a different response compared to loading or bending at an axis that's rotated by 90 degrees. And so they made this observation that if the bone is loaded in a direction that's atypical to its habitual loading, it will respond more vigorously. We don't really know the reason for this, but that's been observed. And then finally, when we start talking about, or thinking about a loading regimen, the interval between loading bouts makes a difference. So if I apply 50 cycles of loading right now, and then another bout of 50 in 2 hours, that's going to be less effective than if I applied 50 cycles of loading today, and then another 50 cycles of loading tomorrow, where there's been a longer interval between the loading bouts. So bone loses its mechanosensitivity when you start loading it, and it recovers I'm not sure if it's slowly or quickly, but nevertheless, it takes about 24 hours for the sensitivity to recover. So therefore, the interval between loading bounds makes a difference. You can actually play this the other way around. So instead of doing a bout of loading on one go, so 50 cycles of loading right now, you could split that into 2 bouts of 25, for example, and do one now, and another, let's say, 6 hours later. And in the intervening 6 hours, the mechanosensitivity will have recovered to some extent, and so therefore the second bout of loading is going to add on to the response of the first bout of loading. At least theoretically, it hasn't been tested in humans to my knowledge. I've highlighted Mancuso's review here, which is from this year, so quite recent, I'd argue. Although I'm plugging primarily my own work, I wanted to highlight this Mancuso's review just to sort of indicate that what I've claimed here is sort of not contentious, or it is sort of shared understanding of how bone load responds to loading. So do have a look at that review. I thought it was quite a good review.
Right, with the revisions out of the way, we'll move on to taking a look at some of the findings I found, and I will present a few findings by others as well, but I keep plugging my own work. So first of all, when we look at meta-analysis of various loading interventions, and these are all based on computed tomography, these findings, we tend to find that exercise is effective in improving bone health or adding more bone prior to puberty, and possibly beneficial in adulthood and around menopause, maybe minimizing bone losses at menopause, but the evidence is not that strong after puberty. But this is with computed tomography, we got mountains of more evidence using DEXA, and with those meta-analyses, it does look like increased loading is effective in improving and maintaining bone mass at various phases of life. On the flip side of the coin, with unloading, so immobilization, paralysis, spaceflight, we see really rapid bone loss, and it's primarily endocortical. So even though during growth we know that we can lose pericortical bone, so bone from the outside, and this is when the at the metaphysis that's developing, if we didn't excavate away some of the pericortical bone, we would end up with ridiculously robust bones. So we know that this happens. Pericortical bone is excavated away during growth at the metaphysis, but for some reason it doesn't appear that after the modeling phase of growth there is any pericortical bone loss that I've seen. There are some papers that indicate, at least indirectly, that maybe there is some pericortical loss, but it's definitely not nearly as strong as endocortical and intracortical bone loss. So initially very rapid bone loss, and it does actually seems to keep on losing more and more bone over time in case of long-term paralysis. On the other hand, loaded bones are maintained, so in those individuals who are only partially paralyzed, so hemiplegics, their arm bones are just as strong as someone who can walk and does walk, and may even be stronger because they use their arm musculature for ambulation. So we start from a young age, and this is from an Australian project called the Look Study, where in this case we were looking at the baseline results from an intervention study, and we categorized the children into active and fit, active and unfit, inactive and fit, and inactive and unfit based on pedometry for the physical activity, and the 20-meter shuttle for the fitness. And when we compared those who were active and fit to those who were inactive and unfit, we observed about 7% difference in boys, and not as marked a difference among girls, but nevertheless we did see a slight difference here at the posterior border. So again, very much in line with the meta-analysis results from based on interventions where pre-puberty exercise seems to be effective in improving bone health or bone mass. So here we have an intervention study from Sweden. So these were children that started off at 6 to 9 years of age in school, and this is a school-based intervention where the intervention school were given 40 minutes of physical education every single school day, whereas the control group received the normal 60 minutes per week of physical education. And after 7 years of this intervention, these scans were taken. And the findings were such that the boys in the intervention school did not differ from the controls, whereas in girls there was a 2% difference that was observed. So it's a relatively small improvement in bone gains, and only in girls. But on the other hand, this was not tailored bone activity. This was rather generic physical education, as you would have in the Nordic countries. It's not all rainbows and unicorns though. I wanted to highlight this cross-sectional study here. So in this case, the data set is from the Griffith University, so again Australian data, and we categorized these children into 3 tertiles based on bone-specific physical activity questionnaire. And on this occasion we saw no difference whatsoever between boys or girls in the different bone-specific physical activity tertiles prior to puberty, which, as I mentioned, has been flagged in the literature as sort of to have the most evidence for exercise being effective. And then on the other hand, post-pubertally, that's where we started observing those differences between those who have had less bone-specific physical activity compared to those who have engaged in more bone-specific physical activity. So my interpretation here is that this is sort of what I expect. The longer you're exposed to bone loading, the more marked the difference becomes. But of course you're free to interpret this in some other way as well. One of the interesting bits I found in this particular study was that this is so well in line with what we find with athletes. So the difference between the bone-specific physical activity questionnaire tertiles are more marked at the anterior and the posterior aspect of the tibia compared to the lateral median, both in boys and in girls post-puberty. This study here isn't actually one of my own, and I'm presenting it sort of out of order because I already spoke about post-pubertal, but these actually were pre-pubertal. But the reason I wanted to present this here is because I find this very convincing evidence of the effect of bone loading for bone accrual or adding more bone. So this is a study from somewhere in the United States by Wetterholt and Warden, where they used, it's a prospective study of children engaging with baseball, and they got the throwing arm, which is the bottom panel here, and the non-throwing arm, which is the top panel here. And as you'd expect, they did lay on more bone with growth in their non-throwing arm, but they laid on more bone on their throwing arm. And this is a year-long follow-up. of the same individual, so obviously the same genes because it's a contralateral control limb model, and to me this is very convincing evidence of what can be achieved by added loading. And that's really all I wanted to point out here, is that even though I just presented the sort of the conflicting evidence of nothing being seen in a cross-sectional setting prior to puberty, on the other hand, when we actually look at the prospective data set, where the control is the same individual with the absolute same genes, but we do observe this increase in bone strength or bone mass when engaging with quite sort of extensive loading caused by throwing the baseball. I don't really have a lot to say about clinical cases in general, but I did want to include this particular example here of children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This is a data set from the Princess Margaret Hospital for Children from Perth. We did an audit with Aris Siafarikas, and this was one of the groups that I found really interesting. So when I was going through the scans, I didn't know the diagnosis of any of the scans, and when I was just going through them, I found this group that was really peculiar, with tiny tibia and absolutely normal looking fibula, and I thought these are going to be the osteoporosis imperfecta children, and that's because I'm not a clinician. I didn't know that their bones would look like any other bones. So when we then went on to review the diagnosis of these scans, we found out that these children were Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this is, of course, it's sort of an interesting case, but I already flagged that I find fibula quite interesting because it does not seem to respond to loading. And this is one of the sort of the reasons I say that, is when we look at the fibula. So at the top panel, we've got tibia here. We've got two columns. So the first column is with respect to age, and the second column is with respect to body mass. So looking at total area of the tibia, our children with DMD are way below what would be expected for their age, and the same for body mass. So they're way below what would it be expected for their body mass, and it's very conspicuous here when looking at this plot. This is unadjusted, but nevertheless it's quite conspicuously obvious that the tibia is much smaller with DMD, so with the black trace, compared to the grey trace. But then when we look at the fibula, in terms of what's expected for the age, we can't really tell most of these kids apart from children with no diagnosed bone disease. Or the same with respect to body mass. Again, we can't really tell them apart from children that, they may actually have some diagnosis. The control data set, or the comparison, is again the data set from Griffith University, but they were not specifically recruited because they had any condition. They were actually recruited as healthy individuals. So so you can't really tell children with DMD apart from children without, or non-affected children, based on their fibula, whereas you can very clearly tell them apart based on their tibia. And so the reason I'm flagging this again is I tried to raise the hypothesis that perhaps we could use the fibula as an indicator of sort of the phenotype of the individual and contrast that against the tibia to sort of have an idea of what sort of a loading history has this individual had, or maybe to look at the effects of anabolic drugs or anti-reabsorptive drugs, whether these sort of the fibula serving as the genetic control compared to a load that does respond to weight bearing. So that hypothesis was quite soundly rejected by the reviewers, with the claim that you haven't produced enough evidence. Fair enough. This was the evidence I was trying to present, and that went nowhere. We'll then move into how do we apply the osteogenic principles, or the principles governing the mechanical response of bone to loading in interventions, and we're now getting on to some pretty heavy lifting in terms of biomechanics. So I've got a example of what the loads look like in jumping here. So that's the ground reaction force, and this is a counter movement jump. And so while I'm standing still early in the video, nothing changes. That the dip here is the squatting bit before then taking off. So the takeoff starts from about here. That's the foot of the ground, and that's the landing peak. So sort of you'd go, surely that's as good as we can do for bone loading. Two observations here. The takeoff phase, the maximal load, which would be this peak here, is lower than the landing phase. Also, the rate of load increase is actually much higher at the landing compared to the takeoff. So immediately looking at this force trace, we can sort of start making sort of predictions of what might be more effective for bones. So these landing peaks probably are more effective for bones than the takeoff peak. But there's many other things to consider. Well, that's as high as I can jump off the ground. I can do another type of jumping, shown here, where I'm only just leaving the ground, but the peak height is actually about 2 times the peak height of this jump here. And so this just goes to show that, first of all, it's difficult to guesstimate what the bone loss are going to be without actually measuring. So this was a massive surprise to me, that I'm able to produce much more ground reaction force with these small little jumps by having relatively straight knees at the point of contact. So these are not to scale. So this peak here is about 3 times body weight, and this peak here is about 6 times body weight. So how do we get around the fact that it's difficult to guesstimate bone strains? Well, we can do strain modeling, and this really is the only way. So the other way would be in vivo bone strain measurements, but they are quite bloody, and it's sort of easier to accept modeling. And also with modeling, you can look at any bone site, whereas with strain gauges, you can really only access superficial bone sites. It's difficult to access anything that's deep within soft tissues. So the approach is you do motion capture, as shown on the right here. So a person moving, image from multiple camera angles. We can then capture the movement and impose the movement on a musculoskeletal model, and then in this case we modeled the strains of the tibia here, and you can see that the colors change throughout the gait cycle. This model here was done by Rami Al-Nazar, one of my colleagues, and I asked Rami about the colors, and his response is there's just a visualization. Well, it's a nice looking video anyways. I suspect it was linked somehow to the model strains, but maybe it was just he just added colors. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. Well, with this we can start looking at different bone sites and site-specific strains. Again, this may look a little bit busy to begin with, but the first of all, at the top here we got the tibia. Trace number 1 is the anterior aspect of tibia, which in walking is loaded in tension, so it's being prolonged or elongated. And then number 4 is posterior aspect of tibia, and that's going to be compressed in walking because it's being bent backwards by the soleus muscle pulling on it. And so at the same time instant, different parts or aspects of the bone are either loaded in tension, in compression, or really not loaded at all. So at the neutral axis, there's really no loading whatsoever, almost throughout the gait cycle. So that's one takeaway here. Another takeaway here is that looking at the same activity, walking, and comparing one bone site, so the tibia shaft, to the femoral shaft, we'll observe that at the tibia, the maximal strains are 1000 microstrain, compared to the femoral neck, which goes all the way up to 3000 microstrain, so 3 times the load in the same activity at a different bone site. Again, very difficult to guess that that's going to be the case. When we then start looking at different activities, looking at leg press, the load is about 2500 microstrain at the peak in the tibia shaft, whereas in squatting, which sounds like that's a heavy exercise, that's going to make a big difference on bone health, it's actually 1/3 of that, so comparable to walking at the tibia shaft. On the other hand, if we start looking at activities that bend the tibia actively, in knee extension, so unilateral knee extension exercise, we can get all the way up to 3000 microstrain on the tibial shaft. So the absolute load in knee extension exercise is much lower than in leg press, but the corresponding bone loads are actually higher in knee extension exercise, and that's caused by the fact that we are bending the bone instead of compressing it. And the same exercise, seemingly same exercise of knee flexion, we don't actually see that much bone strains, but that tends to be, that's quite often the case, that our extensor muscles are stronger compared to our flexor muscles. So it's not that surprising that knee extension results in higher strains compared to knee flexion. So we never actually published the comparison between different exercises, but Saulo Martelli and so colleagues from Marcus Bandy's group in Melbourne did go ahead and do very similar modeling to what we did, and proceeded to not cite our work. So that's why I'm plugging my work, is I've seen this before. I'm still absolutely fuming at Bandy's group for not citing our work. Let's put that aside and we'll take a look at what they found. So looking at the femoral neck in various exercises, they found that the peak tensile strain was the highest in hip extension, even higher than in long jump. So long jump would be considered a high impact exercise, which are long thought to be beneficial for bone strength. Then you got your knee flexion, hip flexion. So again, similar findings to what we found on the knee, causing a bending force or a torque over a bone causes high strains. Then they got the vertical jump here that lost to walking. So walking has higher loading on the femoral neck compared to vertical jump. Yeah, then you got your stair descent, stair ascent, and finally squat with weight. So weighted squats don't seem to do really anything to your femoral neck, because the load on the femoral neck is actually lower than in walking. Add to that the fact that with a weight you're not going to be moving quickly, so the strain rate is going to be low compared to walking. And this really sort of is my key takeaway from this biomechanical aspect of my talk. It's really, really difficult to guess what's going to be beneficial for bone, and you really need to think carefully in targeting the specific bone site with the appropriate bone loads in order to start reaping benefits. So it's very easy to design an exercise program that is ineffective in improving bone. So squatting would be a really good way of not getting any bone gains while still doing sort of really heavy training of training that feels heavy. The final thing I'll sort of touch on in terms of how it's difficult to guess what the loads are going to be is this effect of inter-individual variation in how we engage with a particular exercise. This is again data from the Griffith University from Ben Weeks and Belinda Beck's 2008 paper. I was given access to the ground reaction force traces, and I was really interested in looking at the inter-individual variation in how do we execute an exercise. So if people are asked to do walking, women are plotted with red and men with blue. We tend to get a really sort of stereotypical trace, reaction force trace. So walking, probably if you ask people to walk, they load their bones sort of similarly. But immediately when we move to running, we already start seeing very sort of marked differences between individuals here. So individuals plotted with dashed lines. So most people in this data set have done their running on the ball of their foot, where then you'll have this sort of bell shape. However, these few individuals here, instead of running on the ball of their feet, they've had heel contact, and so that's what you'll get then. You'll get a peak early on, and then a prolonged contact. It lasts longer than running on the ball of your foot, and already running is going to be, if you prescribe running, it's not going to be the same bone loads between individuals, let alone hopping on one leg, shown here. So it's all over the map. Some individuals have done hopping on the ball of their foot and really rapid contact, and others have really sort of taken their time on the ground. And the same with continuous jumping. There really isn't a representative trace to be drawn from continuous jumping. So if you prescribe continuous jumping, be prepared to see really varied response in bone depending on how the exercise was actually executed. So it needs to be really well supervised exercise, paying really close attention to the technique if you want to get the same results out of different individuals. Well, that brings me on to my final slide here, prior to getting on to summary, of course, which is load monitoring. So one way of trying to monitor bone loads would be by using an accelerometer, and that's precisely what Timo Rantalainen's group from Oulu has done. Oulu is in ICT in Finland, and they had a 12-month loading intervention with premenopausal women, which was effective in maintaining femoral neck BMD. And so this is they wore the accelerometer also during their training sessions. And when we look at the histogram of acceleration peaks, we can clearly see the intervention here. So black bars being the intervention group, and gray bars being the control group. And so acceleration peaks above 3 times body weight are much higher in the exercise group, and that's because they were prescribed exercise or jumping exercise that causes these higher exercise induced peaks. And the average daily number of impacts in the first 6 months at this high end spectrum of accelerations was positively associated with 1 year BMD change in this particular dataset, and the association was relatively strong as well, with like 25% of the variation explained by just looking at waist-borne accelerometer acceleration peaks. So even though waist-borne accelerometer will ignore all of the information regarding whether it was bending or compressive loads and all of that notwithstanding, it nevertheless is indicative of bone loading, at least in this particular intervention study it was. So to me, the sort of the takeaway from this is that you should definitely be doing load monitoring. So not just observing how many reps were executed and what was the external resistance, but rather you'd like to know how quickly the bar was moving. So you'd like to get the sort of the full picture of the load, which is something that you do gain with an accelerometer for body weight resisted exercises. So that brings me to my summary. So what? Who cares about exercise? Well, of course I care about exercise because I'm a biomechanist, but it has been shown quite convincingly that if you do make your bone stronger, you will have fewer fractures. A 10% difference in population mean is sufficient to show this phenomenon. So if you have a population that has 10% more BMC compared to another population, the population with the 10% higher BMC will have fewer fractures. Secondly, drugs improve BMD over 2 years by about 10%, and we know that drugs have repeatedly been shown to be effective in decreasing fractures. So 10% mark is what you'd like to get in order to think that exercise is meaningful for fracture prevention. All the data we have suggests that physically active lifestyle can make much more than that 10% difference. Looks like it's probably actually about 20%. So therefore I care about exercise, and I think you should care about exercise as well. It can make a difference. It just needs to be taken. It's like any other medication. Use it or lose it. It's not going to be effective unless you actually engage with it. So in conclusion, physically active lifestyle helps optimize bone health. However, bone exercise needs to be targeted. The unfortunate bit there is that osteogenicity is difficult to guesstimate, so you'd really like to have used modeling or strain gauge measures. The scales would tip towards modeling in my case, because then you can assess many more bone sites compared to your strain gauges. How would I apply this in clinical populations? I wouldn't, because I have no idea. I'm not medically trained. But the one group sort of that immediately springs to mind is osteogenesis imperfecta, where you have fractures, but I'm not entirely sure if you would be able to prevent those fractures by exercise, because the issue is not the bone mineral content, is something else. Well, luckily you all are the medical experts, so take this information and use it in a way that improves patients' care. With that, I'm all done, and thanks for listening.